Thanks for having me. Yeah, so this is the 7th annual Front End of Innovation Conference, which means that innovation is kind of here to stay. It's kind of an interesting transformation from where it started. I think that 5 or 10 years ago, people who were in charge of innovation were spending a lot of their time just trying to figure out what that job title meant and what they had to do as part of that job and what they were on the hook for. And it seems that as a profession, innovation has kind of come into its own, and in terms of a job description, we've got some clarity on it. And I think as part of that, just one observation I would make is that the term front end of innovation is kind of changed, right? I mean, front end of innovation used to mean that first fuzzy step before you would then go do product development. And that's where much of the conversation was 7 years ago. I think now what's interesting is that the front end of innovation means what are all the parts and pieces and all the groundwork that we have to lay so that our companies can innovate. And it's a much broader mandate than it may have been a few years ago. And it's in that light that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about some broad issues around innovation and some broad issues around capability, around what it really takes to innovate. Now, all of this, shameless plug, is in support of my new book, Wired to Care, which is really around this notion of empathy. And when you first come up to it, it's not necessarily the case that empathy should have a direct line linked to innovation. But in our experience, it does. And in fact, it's the biggest difference between companies that we see that are able to innovate and grow and those that get stuck somewhere along the way. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. And probably the best way to explain it is to give you an example. And that example is one from a company that most of us, I'm sure all of us, have heard of before. That company is Microsoft. You may remember that in the mid-90s, Microsoft found itself in an interesting place, facing a threat that it had not predicted before. You see, up until that time, Microsoft had spent the last 10, 15 years pummeling the heck out of people like Apple and IBM for dominance of the desktop. And they now looked and saw that there was something that was threatening them that they hadn't even counted on before. You see, that threat came from Sony. Sony had decided to launch the PlayStation 2, and upon announcing its impending launch, Microsoft knew that it was in trouble. You see, up until this time, the PlayStation 2 or the PlayStation 1 and video game consoles that had come before it were just that. They were toys for kids to play with. But the PS2 was going to be something totally different. The PS2 was going to have a DVD player in it so we could all watch movies on this thing. And it was going to have an internet connection so we could browse the internet. The PlayStation 2 promised to be the kind of digital media center of the home. And this scared Microsoft to death. Because suddenly, maybe we didn't need a personal computer at all. Maybe we could just spend our time on this thing. So Microsoft knew it needed to act. Now, when you hear Microsoft getting into a game, you think, well, they're the big kahuna, they're going to dominate because they have scale and they have money and they have the time to wait it out. But in this case, Microsoft was not in the dominant position. Right? It wasn't in this business. Sony had already been in games for a number of years at this point. And Microsoft looked at this and said, well, we know everything about software, but we don't know much about hardware. And while we know a lot about the office and about work, we know very little about homes and play and what people do for fun. So it realized that they needed to do something truly different if they were going to succeed. To approach this problem, they went out, they gathered together a group of people. Some of these folks were kind of classic Microsofties, but a lot of these people they brought in from the outside. These folks were not the kind of folks who had worked on Windows or Microsoft Word or something like that. And they said, guys, just go at it. We need to come up with something really great. Come up with a game console, something that's truly different. It doesn't have to work on Windows. It doesn't have to be something you can work on Microsoft Word or Excel on. Just come up with something truly amazing. And these folks went to work. They knew exactly what to do. And the reason they knew what to do is because they loved to play video games. They didn't just love to play any kind of video games. They loved a particular kind of video game, the kind of video games that get rated M for mature. You see, most of the guys on the Microsoft development team were 35 years old, going on 15. And what they really loved to play video games for was to get online with their friends so they could beat the crap out of them. But what they loved was like pummeling them out and getting all of their aggression out. And maybe they were the kid who was picked on in school, but this is their way of getting back back if the world was living their heroism through video games. And the more violence and guts and blood video games had, the better it was for them. They loved to travel to other planets and meet all sorts of cool alien races so they could kill them. And when they looked at this Sony PlayStation thing, they said, that's okay. If you want to create some game console where people can romp through some magic fairy forest, talking to Smurfs and collecting magic mushrooms, that's okay, but that's not what we're going to make. We're going to create something that's truly hardcore, something for people like us. And so that's what they did. And they launched something called the Microsoft Xbox in the fall of 2001. And this thing was a rampant success. It was sold out in its first weekend, and its signature game, Halo, which was one of those violent first-person shooter games, went on to become a video game classic. Microsoft sold over 24 million units worldwide of the Xbox, and in its next version, the Xbox 360, it actually went on to become the #1 game console in the world. Now, interestingly enough, this was the first successful US game console in over a generation. It had been over 20 years since any American company had successfully competed in video games. Just shout it out. Anyone remember the last successful American game console? Atari, you're right. That's a long time ago, right? And a lot of people had tried to come into that space in between and weren't able to do it. So Microsoft knew it was onto something. They said, we have found a formula for innovation. We have found a way to compete. We have found a way to go in against a brilliant, dominant competitor and give them a run for their money. So confident were they that they applied the same technique to another competitor that had come up. You see, in the fall of 2001, Apple released the iPod. Now just show of hands, informal survey, how many of you have an iPod? Just to get a sense. There you go. That's a pretty successful innovation, I would say. Apple had sold 60 million iPods by 2006. And Microsoft said, well, we know what to do with these guys. We're going to do the same thing to Apple that we did to Sony. So they took the same team that had worked on Xbox, the people who had come up with this winning game console, and set them to work, gave them a similar amount of time and a similar budget, and told them, go at it, break the rules, but do the same thing to Apple that you did to Sony. And working at it for 2 years, the team came up with something that was lovingly called the Microsoft Zune. Show of hands, how many of you have a Zune? Fascinating. Tumbleweeds, right? This is not surprising. The Zune was clunky, it was slow, it was unpleasant. As one online reviewer described it, the installation process of setting up your Zune is about as pleasurable as having an airbag explode in your face, right? And not surprisingly, Microsoft sold 2 million units in the first 18 months. To give you some sense of scale, in that same time, Apple sold well in excess of 84 million iPods. Now that is the industry definition of having your clock cleaned. And looking at this, we were fascinated by this at Jump. We looked at Zune and said, what happened with this? Why was it that in the case of Xbox, Microsoft was able to enter a market that was dominated by someone else, come up with something new, come up with something very cool, and actually give the lead competitor a run for their money. And then with the same people and the same amount of time and similar budgets, they came up with something completely lousy that was a market failure. And so we spent some time up in Redmond, Washington, and we talked to people who had worked on both projects. And we talked to folks who had been on the original Xbox development team. And if there was one thing we heard over and over and over again, one distinguishing point that was like a big aha for these folks, they said, you know, the biggest difference in all of this stuff wasn't, who, was out there in the world. It was us and our understanding of them. You see, with Zune, the biggest challenge was trying to figure out who we were building it for. And with Xbox, we knew those guys. Hell, we were those guys. And it allowed us to make 10,000 better decisions as a result every single day. All of us know this in this room, that product development is all about making trade-offs and many little decisions that lead up to something that is either a great success or a total failure. And in the case of Xbox, these folks said that we knew what those trade-offs had to be like. And in the case of Zoom, we were relying on PowerPoints.